That night affected things in ways I didn't expect. It all began with a simple request from my stepmom, Celine, asking me to stay home while Dad left for his usual fishing trip at the time. It felt like a typical weekend routine, with just the two of us spending time together. But I was unaware that this night would transform into a unique experience that would challenge our relationship and leave a lasting impact on me. Unusually quiet that morning, the usual hum of Dad's presence. I had just finished my schoolwork and was ready to unwind when Celine summoned me to the living room. "You assisted me with something." Her voice was quiet, almost too casual, and I could tell she was concerned about something, but I couldn't figure out what. I paused for a while, unsure. "What do you need?" I inquired. I made my way over to where she was seated. Celine generally had a serene demeanor, but something about the air felt different today. I couldn't pinpoint it, but something in her gaze quickened my pulse. "Come sit down," she urged. Patting the couch next to her, I did as she instructed, uncertain what would happen next. But I couldn't deny that curiosity was chewing at me. Celine hunched back. She crossed her legs and looked at me with an intensity I hadn't observed before. "You know how much you've grown up?" She stated. Her tone was light, but the words lingered between us, heavy with an unsaid meaning. "You're not the little boy." I used to know that this wasn't like her. We'd always had a cordial, almost casual connection, but something seemed threatening today. I stammered, unsure how to answer, and she leaned in slightly, her gaze never leaving mine. "No," she claimed, "you'd changed." And I believe we both knew it. The way she said it made me shiver. There was a peculiar tension growing in the room, and I didn't know how to break it. "What exactly are you?" I tried to ask, finally forcing the question out. I needed to know what was going on here, and why the air felt so thick with something unspoken. For a moment, she didn't respond. She just looked at me, her eyes searching mine as if she were looking for the right words. Then she sighed and stood. Walking over to the window, "Your father is gone for the weekend," she said quietly, staring out into the yard. "It's just us two here." I nodded, unsure of where this conversation was going, but feeling that knot in my stomach tighten as she turned to face me, her expression unreadable. "You know, I've been thinking," she began, her voice steady but soft. "There are things I've wanted to talk to you about that I've never had the guts to say until now." I swallowed hard, and she took a step closer, her eyes locking on mine. "Like us," she said simply, the word lingering in the air, and I felt my heart quicken. What exactly was she? Signaling that this didn't make sense, I attempted to laugh it off, but my voice came out shaky. "What do you mean, us?" Celine gave a faint, knowing smile that made my tummy flip. "Have you noticed it as well?" She asked, her voice a low murmur about the way things have changed between us. We're not just stepmother and stepson anymore. My mind whirled, attempting to grasp her words and comprehend the unfolding events. However, a part of me intuitively understood her words, recognizing the shift in our relationship over the past few months, the subtle glances, and the lingering touches. However, I had consistently ignored these feelings. I persuaded myself that I had no idea what you were discussing, uttering my words in a barely audible whisper. She came even closer, her presence overpowering, and the room suddenly felt much too tiny. "Yes, you do," she replied quietly, her fingertips brushing lightly across my arm. "You also felt it." I rose up quickly and stepped away from her, trying to clear my mind. "Celine, this is insane," I muttered, my voice quivering. "You're my stepmother. We shouldn't," but she didn't back down. She followed me, closing the gap between us once again. "Why not?" she muttered, her eyes burning with an intensity that made my heart beat. "We're both adults, and we don't have to obey anybody else's rules," so I shook my head, attempting to fight the pull that was bringing me closer. "No, this isn't right," I argued, even though I could feel my resolve slipping. "But what if it was she?" Countered, her hand reaching out to touch my cheek. The contact sent a jolt through me, and for a moment I was frozen, trapped in the web she was weaving around us. I desired to say no, push her away, flee the room, and forget that this had ever occurred. However, I was unable to do so. Something kept me firmly in place, and I harbored remorse for allowing it. I couldn't shake the feeling that things were spiraling out of control. The tension in the house had grown unbearable. Every time I saw Celine, it felt like we were in a precarious situation. I attempted to maintain a safe distance, minimizing time spent alone with her, but it proved challenging. She consistently found a method to establish her presence, whether it was through a casual touch on my arm or a glance across the room. There was always this simmering tension that refused to go away until the night everything changed. Dad was working late, and I was trying to stay holed up in my room, hoping that if I avoided her long enough, things would go back to normal. But deep down, I knew that wasn't going to happen. I could hear her moving around downstairs, the sound of the TV playing softly in the background, the clock ticking loudly on my wall, each second dragging on, making it harder to ignore the reality of the situation. I thought about calling a friend and making up an excuse to leave the house, but suddenly she glanced up. Her gaze met mine, and I knew there was no going back. She couldn't fall asleep, she inquired, her voice smooth and almost too casual. There was something in the way she said it that made my pulse speed in the same way it had the first day. Yes, I murmured, not trusting myself to say anything further, and I walked over to the couch and sat down, leaving as much space between us as possible. But even with that distance, I could feel the tension between us thick and unspoken. We sat in silence for a few moments, the only sound being the quiet hum of the TV. I could feel her watching me, her eyes lingering on me in a way that made my skin tingle. I did not know what to do. I didn't know how to break the silence without making things worse, but before I could say anything, she spoke again. "I've been thinking about us," she explained quietly. My heart skipped a beat when her voice barely rose above a whisper. "Celine," I started, but she cut me off before I could continue. She asked, turning to face me fully, "Why are we pretending? There's nothing between us, when we both know there is." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to argue, to tell her that she was wrong and that we couldn't go down this path. But the truth is, I didn't have the strength to fight it anymore. I had felt it too, the strange pull between us that had only grown stronger with time. I had tried to ignore it, and tried to convince myself that it wasn't real, but now sitting here with her, I couldn't deny it any longer. "We can't do this," I said through my voice, lacked conviction. Even as I said the words, I knew they were a lie. I was lying to her, lying to myself. She leaned in closer, her hand resting on the cushion between us. "We're not doing anything wrong," she whispered, her voice low and intense. "We're not hurting anyone." I shook my head, trying to clear the fog that had settled over my thoughts. "But it's not right," I argued weakly. She reached out and placed her hand on mine, her touch sending a jolt of electricity through me. "Who says what's right and what's wrong?" she asked, her voice steady, her gaze never leaving mine. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to pull away. I wanted to tell her to stop, but I couldn't. I was trapped by the intensity of the moment, by the feelings I'd been trying to deny for so long. "We don't have to follow anyone else's rules," she whispered, her fingers lightly touching, tracing patterns on the back of my hand. "We can decide for ourselves what's right." I closed my eyes, trying to block out the sound of her voice and the feel of her touch, but it was no use. The walls I had built around myself were crumbling, and I didn't know how to stop it before I could say anything, before I could gather the strength to pull away. She leaned in even closer, her lips brushing against my ear as she whispered, "Tell me you don't feel it too." Her words sent a shiver down my spine, and I hated how much my body responded to her and how much I wanted to give in. I opened my mouth to protest and tell her that this was wrong and that we couldn't do this. But no words came out. Instead, I found myself turning to face her breath, catching in my throat as our eyes locked. The moment stars stretched on the tension between us, growing thicker with each passing second, and then without thinking, without planning, I leaned in and kissed her. It was soft at first, tentative, as though we were both testing the waters, unsure of what would happen next, but the kiss quickly deepened the heat between us, rising as we gave in to the desire that had been building for so long. My hands found their way to her waist, pulling her closer as her fingers tangled in my hair. The world around us seemed to disappear, leaving only the two of us lost in the intensity of the moment. I knew it was wrong, and knew that we were crossing a line we could never come back from. But I couldn't stop. I didn't want to stop as the kiss deepened, and my mind raced with 1,000 conflicting thoughts. I knew this was dangerous. We knew that we were playing with fire, but there was a part of me that didn't care. A part of me that had wanted this for longer than I was willing to admit. When we finally pulled apart, both of us were breathing heavily. Our faces were inches apart. Her eyes were dark, filled with something I couldn't quite name, and I knew that things would never be the same between us. "I've wanted this for so long," she whispered, her breath warm against my skin, "and I know you have too." I didn't respond. I couldn't. The truth was too much for me to handle, too overwhelming. Instead, I just nodded, my heart pounding in my chest as the weight of what we had just done settled over me. But even then, I knew it wasn't over. The kiss had only been the beginning. There was more. There would always be more. After that night, everything changed. Between us, I couldn't look at Celine the same way every time our eyes met. I felt a rush of heat, a reminder of what we've done, and of the unspoken promise of what might happen again in the air in the house, charged with something dangerous. We both understood, but didn't dare acknowledge openly. Days passed in a tense, awkward silence. I kept my distance as best I could, but it was impossible to avoid her completely. With every brush of her hand, every passing glance felt like a spark threatening to ignite the tension that simmered just beneath the surface. I knew what was happening wasn't right, but there was a pull between us that I couldn't ignore, no matter how hard I tried. One afternoon, while Dad was out again, the silence in the house felt unbearable. I was pacing the living room, trying to distract myself with the TV, but my thoughts kept drifting back to her. The memory of that kiss, the way her lips had felt against mine, the way my heart had raced. It was all too much. I hated myself for thinking about it. But I couldn't stop. Just when I thought I might lose my mind, I heard her footsteps behind me. I turned to see Celine standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable for a moment. Neither of us spoke. The tension between us was thick and heavy, with everything left unsaid. "We need to talk," she said finally, her voice low, almost hesitant. I nodded, knowing this conversation was inevitable even if I wasn't ready for it. "Yeah," I agreed, my throat tight. "We do." She walked over to the couch, sitting down with a sigh. I followed, sitting across from her, keeping a careful distance. My heart was pounding in my chest and I couldn't quite meet her eyes. I didn't know how to start. I didn't know what to say that would make any of this better. "I know things have been different," she began, her hands clasped in her lap, "and I don't want you to feel uncomfortable. That's the last thing I want." I swallowed hard in my mouth. "I don't know what to feel," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I mean, this isn't normal, right? We're not supposed to feel this way." Celine looked down at her hands, her expression troubled. "I know," she said softly, "but it's not something we can just ignore either." I didn't have an answer for her. The truth was, I didn't know what we were supposed to do. Everything felt wrong. But at the same time, there was a part of me that didn't want it to stop. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't rationalize it. But the feelings were there, undeniable, and really, there was a long silence between us. Filled with the weight of everything we weren't saying, I could feel the tension building again, that same dangerous pull that had led us down this path in the first place. And then before I could stop myself, I said I thought about it too. The words were out of my mouth before I could take them back. And once they were spoken, there wasn't saying I could feel the tension building again, that same dangerous pull that had led us down this path in the first place. And then before I could stop myself, I said I think about it too. The words were out of my mouth before I could take them back. And once they were spoken, there was no undoing them. Celine's eyes flicked up to meet mine, and in that moment, I knew there was no going back. We had crossed a line, and now we were standing on the edge of something even more dangerous. She didn't say anything at first, but the look in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. There was a heat, there was a need that mirrored my own, and it terrified me. But at the same time, it excited me in a way I couldn't deny. "We can't keep doing this," I said, my voice shaky, though even as I said it, I wasn't sure I believed it. Celine's gaze never left mine. "I know," she whispered, "but we're already here, aren't we?" The room felt too. The air was too thick. I wanted to run, to put as much distance between us as possible, but I couldn't move. I was trapped not by her, but by my own desires. The pull between us was too strong and overwhelming to resist before I knew what was happening. She leaned in, her face inches from mine. I could feel her breath on my skin, warm and soft, and my heart pounded in my chest for a split second. I thought I might be able to stop it, to pull away and end this before it went any further. But then her lips were on mine, and all rational thought. The kiss was disappeared. Different this time. It wasn't hesitant or unsure. It was full of the tension we had been holding back, the desire that had been building for so long. I kissed her back without thinking, my hands resting on the couch, gripping the fabric to keep myself grounded. It wasn't about love or affection. It was about need, and raw, burning need that neither of us could control. My heart was racing. My mind was a blur of thoughts I couldn't grasp. All I knew was that in this moment there was no turning back. When we finally pulled apart, both of us were breathless, our foreheads resting against each other. The weight of what we had just done hung heavy in the air. But neither of us moved to break the moment. "We have to stop," I said again, though my voice was weak, lacking conviction. Celine nodded, her breath warm against my skin. "I know," she whispered, "but it's so hard, isn't it?" Didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. We were trapped in this web we had woven, and no matter how much we told ourselves we needed to stop, the pull between us kept dragging us back together. And that's when it happened. She leaned into me again, and we couldn't resist it. It all happened so quickly. As it had begun, it was over, I think, because it was a bit too exciting for me, but she didn't seem to care after we were done. She smiled at me, letting me know she liked it a lot. The next few days passed in a blur. We tried to act normal, tried to pretend that nothing had happened, but the tension between us was undeniable. Every time I saw her, I felt that same rush of heat, that same dangerous pull. It was like we were circling each other, waiting for the moment when we would finally give in again, and I knew it was only a matter of time. One evening, when Dad was out late for work, I found myself in the kitchen trying to distract myself by making dinner. But the silence in the house was deafening, and I couldn't focus on every sound that seemed to echo, reminding me of the weight of what we were doing. I didn't hear her come in at first, but when I turned around, there she was leaning against the doorframe, watching me with that same unreadable expression. "She needs any help?" she asked, her voice casual, but there was something beneath it, something the insect that made my pulse quicken. "No, I'm good," I said, and though my hands were shaking, she walked over to me, standing too close to her overwhelming presence. Are you sure? I swallowed hard, trying to steady myself. Celine, we can't start, but she cut me off. We don't have to do anything, she said softly, her eyes locked on mine. But I think we both know where this is going. The words hung between us, heavy and balanced. Finally, I wanted to argue and wanted to tell her she was wrong, but I couldn't because, deep down, I knew she was right. We stood there in silence in the space. It was quick, almost fleeting, but it was enough to reignite everything we had been trying to hold back. My heart pounded in my chest, and I knew that this was only the beginning. The weeks that followed were a blur of stolen moments and fleeting glances, living in two separate worlds, one where everything seemed normal, and another where CLA and I were constantly on the verge of something we couldn't control. Despite the weight of our secret, we couldn't distance ourselves from each other, no matter how much I reminded myself that it needed to end. We needed to stop it from happening every time Dad left for work or stayed out late. The tension between us grew. I'd find myself in the same room as her, and without saying a word, we'd both know what was coming next. It was terrifying how easily we had slipped into this. Every touch and every look felt like we were crossing some invisible line, yet it was terrifying how easily we had slipped into this. Every touch and every look felt like we were crossing some invisible line, yet it was never enough to make either of us pull back. Instead, we were drawn closer together, as if something bigger than both of us was guiding us down this path. One Saturday afternoon, the air in the house felt especially thick. Dad was at a company event and wouldn't be back until late. I could feel the shift the moment I woke up that morning, the quiet anticipation that had become all too familiar as the hours ticked by. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something we wouldn't be able to come back from. Celine was in the kitchen when I walked in, washing dishes with her back to me. But she must have known I was there because she didn't flinch when I stood by the door watching her, for a moment unsure of what to say or do. This had become routine, this strange dance we were caught in, and I knew the steps all too well. She turned off the faucet and wiped her hands on the towel before turning to face me for a second. Neither of us spoke. The silence was loud, filled with everything we weren't saying. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft, her eyes searching mine. I wasn't. I hadn't been for a while, but how could I admit that? How could I explain the raging storm inside me, the constant battle between right and wrong? I don't know. I finally replied with my voice barely audible. Celine walked toward me, stopping just a few feet away. "I've been thinking." She began her words slow and deliberate. "It is possible that we should discuss the events that have occurred." I was uncertain about whether I wanted to engage in this discussion. What was there to say that hadn't already been said with our actions? But she wasn't backing down. And I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. "What's there to talk about?" I asked, my heart racing. She sighed, rubbing her forehead with the back of her hand. "I don't know. Maybe we need to figure it out. Where this is going, we can't keep living like this, pretending it's not happening." She was correct, but the news didn't sit well with me. "Where do you think it's going?" I asked. My voice is sharper than I intended. Celine flinched slightly but didn't break eye contact. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I do know that we can't keep tiptoeing around it." I ran a hand through my hair, frustration bubbling up inside me. What do you want from me?" I snapped, not because I was angry with her but because I didn't have the answers either. "Do you? Would you like me to confirm that I am amenable to this?" "I am not. I'm not fine with any of this." Her expression softened, and she stepped closer, closing the distance between us. "I don't want you to be fine with it," she said quietly. "I just want you to be honest with yourself with me." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, because I knew exactly what she meant. I had been lying to myself for so long, convincing myself that this was just a phase that would end if we ignored it long enough. But the truth was, I couldn't stop thinking about her. Couldn't stop wanting her. And the more I tried to fight it, the stronger it became. I don't know how to do that, I admitted. My voice was bursting with emotion. I don't know how to be honest about this. Celine reached out her hand, resting gently on my arm. The touch sent a shiver down my spine, and I hated how much I craved it. "It's okay," she whispered, her eyes filled with understanding. "We'll figure it out together." The sincerity in her voice broke something inside me, and before I knew it, I was pulling her closer, kissing her, like it was the only thing keeping me grounded. This time the kiss wasn't rushed or frantic. I was pulling her closer, kissing her like it was the only thing keeping me grounded. This time, the kiss was slow and deliberate, as if we were both grasping onto something that was slipping away. When we finally parted, her forehead rested against mine, and we stood there in silence, our breaths mingling in the small space between us. I could feel her heartbeat fast and erratic, matching my own. "Are we doing this?" I whispered, more to myself than to her. I knew it couldn't last. I knew that something had to give eventually, but I wasn't ready to face that yet. And then one evening, everything came crashing down. I was sitting in the living room, the TV on but muted, my thoughts far away. Celine was upstairs, and Dad was supposed to be out late again, but I wasn't paying attention to the time. I was too wrapped up in my own head, thinking about everything we had done and everything we couldn't undo. The sound of the front door opening snapped me out of my thoughts, and for a moment I froze, panic rising in my chest. I hadn't expected Dad to come home this early. Scrambled to stand up, but before I could react, he was already walking into the living room, his eyes scanning the space before landing on me. "Hey." His voice was casual but tinged with an element that I was unable to identify. "I was wondering what you were doing." "Just watching TV," I replied in my voice tight, trying to keep the panic from showing. I could sense my heart pounding, the guilt piercing me like an electric current. He didn't seem to notice, or maybe he did and was choosing to ignore it. He sat down on the couch, flipping through the channels like it was just another ordinary night. I tried to calm myself, to convince myself that everything was fine, but the weight of what we were hiding was pressing down on me, suffocating me. Celine came down the stairs a few minutes later, her face carefully neutral. She greeted Dad like nothing was wrong, like everything was perfectly normal, but I could see the tension in her eyes, the way her hands fidgeted at her sides. Dinner that night was excruciatingly conversational, and every time Dad spoke, I could feel the walls closing. I couldn't meet Celine's gaze, focus on anything but the knot of fear tightening in my chest. I thought we might make it through the evening without incident, that maybe we'd manage to keep up the facade for one more night. But as we were clearing the table, Dad suddenly turned to me, his expression unreadable. "You've been spending a lot of time with Celine lately," he said, his voice calm but probing. My heart stopped. I glanced at Celine, who had gone pale, her eyes wide with fear. I guess I stammered, trying to keep my voice steady. Dad's gaze lingered on me for a long moment, and I could feel the air in the room shift. "You want to tell me?" he asked, his tone still casual, but there was something in it that made my blood run cold. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. My mind was racing, searching for something, anything that would make this all go away, but I couldn't find the words. I couldn't lie. Not when the truth was hanging in the air between us, so close to being exposed. Celine's hand brushed mine under the table, a silent plea, but it only made the guilt worse. I finally whispered, my voice barely audible, "Nothing." Dad didn't say anything for a long time. He just looked at me with those unreadable eyes, and in that silence, I knew he knew too. As I stood there, the weight of his gaze pressing down on me, I realized There was no escaping what had already begun. Even if the words were left unspoken, the truth was still there waiting, and it would follow me no matter how hard I tried to outrun it.